Low-income communities have borne the brunt of our environmental degradation.
The people who are suffering the impacts of climate change the most are not responsible for generating the change that is impacting them.
This fight for us is a fight for survival. There's either going to be a just adaptation to climate change, a just way to reduce the worst impacts of climate change, or an unjust way of doing it.
California has for a long time been a leader in establishing really strong environmental legislation.
Assembly Bill 32, California's greenhouse gas legislation, says that we have to reduce California's greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020 to 1990 levels. There's nothing like this anywhere in the United States.
In 2010, two oil companies from Texas were trying to come to California and undo what so many in California really supported wholeheartedly.
Two Texas oil companies have a deceptive scheme to take us backwards. They're spending millions pushing Prop 23, which would kill clean energy standards.
What Proposition 23 would have done would have effectively frozen the implementation of AB 32, our greenhouse gas legislation, indefinitely.
What's up, Oakland?
The fight to defend AB 32 was known as the No on 23 campaign, or the fight to defeat the dirty energy proposition.
On the side of working to defeat Prop 23, there were resources from foundations and others, but a lot of that money went to what can be considered the more mainstream environmental groups.
We saw grassroots groups of that had worked in communities for decades, who could stand up and say, you know, we want a seat at this table. Our sisters and brothers in the environmental movement weren't first sure how to invite us in, didn't know quite how to work with us, didn't understand yet that they were living in a different moment.
Our goal statewide is to talk to 209,000 voters, right? And we're going to identify...
For environmental justice, for community-based organizations, to take on a message around health and jobs was so much about how we already talk about this issue in our communities.
We connect social justice issues to the fact that when we change things like the proposition and we overturn them, how those can then benefit our communities, okay?
California is a majority people of color state.
We're the fastest growing sector of the electorate. 73% of voters of color opposed Proposition 23 versus 57% for the white voters.
Communities United Against the Dirty Energy Proposition was the coalition that we formed in order to bring a powerful voice among voters of color in particular to the table.
We're connecting young people with old people, having intergenerational dialogue. We're connecting old school mainstream environmental groups with grassroots base building community organizations.
So what we had actually was this almost a coalition of coalitions. Groups of that have worked in communities for decades. APIN.
The Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, California Environmental Justice Alliance.
We had Oakland Rising as one of our core allies. We had California Calls.
The Greenlighting Institute, an organization called Power Pack.
We had Mobilize the Immigrant Vote, MIV out there. All these folks brought everything they had to the table.
Our work is to make sure that people are informed, engaged, and educated, and we do the mobilization to make sure that they get to the polls.
Part of our model is that we believe people from the neighborhood should talk to people in their neighborhoods. We use door knocking and phone banking.
Hi, my name is Asia. I'm calling from Oakland Rising.
Hello, my name is Earl Thomas. I'm calling from Oakland Rising. I'm Mike of Oakland Rising, and I'm calling on behalf of the California.
How you doing? My name's Sabrina. This is a statewide effort for us to make sure everybody here in the Oakland area gets out and vote.
We went to communities of color and we said, look, these oil companies don't actually care anything about you and your jobs because they've never given us any jobs. But what they want is they want the right to pollute our air, and they want the right to pollute your children.
And then we got Prop 23.
When we go out and talk to people, we talk about Prop 23 and the dirty energy bill. They get right away, like, this is bad for our communities and we need to turn out.
It just shows the incredible thirst for information.
One of the things I think that really stood out is that we were able to reach the communities in their own languages. So we had literature in Laotian and in Spanish and in Chinese.
For me, hip hop has really been a platform not just to amplify the message, but also just to start the conversation with folks who maybe felt marginalized from the environmental movement. What we really try to do is show people that climate change isn't just about polar bears.
And what you saw was communities of color mobilize in huge numbers, come out in the streets and stand up and say, we want clean air, and we're not going to stand with anybody, and we're going to boycott anybody who's trying to pollute our air to make money.
We killed it. Prop 23 went down in flames.
We didn't just beat these oil boys, we beat the pants off these oil boys.
This was the first time, I think, where we were able to bring together all these powerful forces that were really built from the ground up.
Once we saw that we could put together this coalition that had the know-how and the power to go and talk to voters in our community in the tens of thousands, we actually got us a seat at the table.
Communities of color were the deciding margin in the vote on Prop 23. That gives a lot of ideas for me and hopefully for funders to see how can they be investing differently and how can they be supporting people that they don't normally work with.
We know that local grassroots action gets the goods, and increasingly we need to be working with communities of color to make sure that if we want to change America, we have to involve all the voices of America.
If funders can begin to support long-term work in these communities, then you'll have the outcomes, such as the outcome we had around Prop 23, fashioning new alliances and new kinds of relationships between the mainstream environmental groups and the grassroots groups is going to be more and more important over time.
The voices have to come from the bottom up. We need to build the leadership of the folks that are actually the most impacted, the folks that are on the front lines of living next to the refineries, the families that have kids with asthma.
Many of the struggles here in California are very applicable internationally, and in fact, we know from our discussions with groups in Africa and Asia and Latin America that many of them are watching closely.
We know what needs to be done. We begin to build up the work at a local, regional, and statewide level. We begin to connect with each other in a translocal and a trans-state basis. That's how we begin to build up the forces for an international treaty.
If the people in Richmond could succeed to stop Chevron from expanding that refinery, then in the Niger Delta, the women can stop the oil companies from flaring gas.
The face of organizing around climate in California and in the U.S. is changing.
The environmental movement looks a lot more like me and my friends than it does some of the other long-standing organizations.
The future of humanity and the planet must be built on solidarity, on cooperation, on peoples around the world standing together on a common platform and pushing for the same solutions.
This is the future of the environmental movement, and it's a movement of people that see this issue in a different way than I think people have traditionally as well.